I wouldn't think that there are 10 academic institutions of name and repute in the United States which still feature literary study as such.
Why is that?
It has been politicized.
This is literary critic Harold Bloom in 1994 talking about the school of resentment. That's a term he coined for professors and critics who use literature to bolster their own socio-political interests.
Would be new if you didn't.
Pseudo-feminists, pseudo-Marxists, pseudo-historicists, people who are in no way interested in aesthetic values, people who in fact have combined to assure all of us no book, they say, is intrinsically better than any other book. These things are determined by the societal needs of the ruling classes.
They do not care about aesthetic value and artistic style. They do not care about a writer's mastery of rhetoric, narrative, and psychology. For these people, books only have quality when they reflect their own opinions on societal subjects. Shakespeare is not the greatest and most influential stylist of the English language. He's just some white guy who could be replaced by any other white guy, or, even better they'd say, a black woman because her demographic has suffered so much through history and now it's time to give them the recognition patriarchy has long denied them. We must use literature to fight off oppression. Needless to say, the school of resentment has no fans of literature. They're not even capable of evaluating what constitutes great writing. And yet they teach, they grade, and they multiply by brainwashing the young into believing this is true literary criticism.
People are getting doctorates, people are getting undergraduate majors in literature or English, or call it what you will, in thousands of American colleges and universities, and this is not hyperbole, who have never read a play by Shakespeare, have never read one of the Canterbury Tales of Chaucer, who have never read a novel by Charles Dickens or a poem by William Wordsworth.
Literature is not alone in the war against the school of resentment. The same battle is waged in cinema. Since 1952, the British magazine Sight and Sound has made one list per decade of the greatest films of all time. Critics from all over the world are asked to send their own lists of the top 10 best films ever made. Directors have their own separate list. For the critics, Citizen Kane reigned supreme from 62 to 02. Hitchcock's Vertigo fought an exciting uphill battle since it first appeared on the list in 72. At first it was placed in position 17, then 9, 4, 2, and finally in 2012 it sat on the throne as the greatest film of all time.
Husband!
It was a short reign. But before we check why, let's take a look at the changes the list suffered in the last decade. "25 films were replaced. These. 24 films got in. These. The last list had 2 films directed by women. Chantal Akerman's Jeanne Dielman, which jumped 34 positions upwards to take the top spot, being now called the greatest film ever made, even though it was never in a top 10 before. And Claire Denis' Beau Travail, the biggest climber in the list, leaping staggering 71 positions to be called the 7th greatest film of all time. Dang! Now, the list has 11 films directed by women, 8 of them in the top 50, including Cleo from 5 to 7, which was in the mid-200s last decade and now is in position 14.
Yeah, we got a word for that kind of odd in English. It's called suspicious.
I'm not the only one who finds this odd. Check what influential screenwriter Paul Schrader had to say about it. For 70 years, the Sight and Sound poll has been a reliable, if somewhat incremental measure of critical consensus and priorities. Films moved up the list, others moved down, but it took time. The sudden appearance of Jeanne Dielman in the #1 slot undermines the poll's credibility. It feels off, as if someone had put their thumb on the scale, which I suspect they did. This year's SNS poll reflects not a historical continuum, but a politically correct rejiggering. Jeanne Dielman will from this time forward be remembered not only as an important film in cinema history, but also as a landmark of distorted woke reappraisal. Unfortunately, yes. We now live in a world where Jordan Peele's Get Out is tied with Buster Keaton's The General, the recent BLM poster child whose plot is too silly to become a horror classic and whose humor is too timely to become a comedy classic, is officially just as good as the greatest achievement in physical entertainment of the silent era, which in the past was twice in the top 10.
I've seen my profession destroyed by what I call the school of resentment.
Then there's this Daughters of the Dust thing, which I'd never heard about before, and it seems this film from '91 only sprouted into the list out of the blue because Beyoncé made references to it in a video clip, which is as weird a butterfly effect as I've ever seen. Still, the biggest offender of all is the inclusion of Black Girl, a laughably amateurish school project that emerged at 95. This, to put it mildly, this piece of shit would not get a passing grade in writing, acting, editing, directing, production design, or anything related to the art of cinema. But it's about post-colonialism and class relations, so it gets into the big boys club. If we absolutely needed African films, hasn't any voter seen Yelin? That one I'd stand behind. Defenders will spout generalities like being human and empathy, but that's not cinema. That's taking a moral high ground to compensate for your lack of cinematic knowledge. When evaluating a film, what matters is not the movie's message. It's not the point it makes. Critics today fail because of their insistence on thinking of nothing but the story and its themes. Each person has their own interests. Some like films about children, some like films about war, some like dogs, some like the mafia. And though your interest will play an unavoidable part in your rating of a film, that is the part of least importance.
All one can do is try to set aside one's idiosyncratic preferences and look for what, I hope, is aesthetic merit.
What matters is this. How profound is the plot? How sharp is the dialogue? How precise is the composition? How creative is the blocking? How fluid is the editing? How do the style and the story fit? This is what critics should be looking for and teaching their readers and students. But the resented cannot talk about aesthetics because they are cinematically illiterate. Story and theme is all they know, so they can't see anything deeper than sex and color. I can guarantee there are endless non-fiction books that deal with post-colonialism better than Black Girl. There are endless non-fiction books that deal with feminism better than Jeanne Dielman. Endless non-fiction books that deal with white vampirism. What the fuck is even that? Can't you guys even pretend you give a shit about movies? The woke are always going to say these SJW pictures all fit those aesthetics measurements I listed, which I absolutely agree is possible, sometimes. But my question is that really why they're here? There's a so-called critic who put nothing on her list besides films directed by women. Can anyone be naive enough to believe she based each pick on artistic merit alone? That this is not a self-righteous rewriting of history? This type of political voting does no favors to the directors it seeks to promote. This is unfair to truly great films like Daisies, a wonderfully inventive anarchic comedy that deserves a spot without being questioned. On a similar note, Wes Anderson made a list that had nothing but French films, which I find just as skewed and insufferable.
Pas mal, non? C'est français.
Suppose Jeanne Dielman was elected for its undoubtedly studied compositions. Is it truly better in that regard than Parajanov's The Color of Pomegranates, which fell off the list? Then maybe Jeanne Dielman is here for its calculated narrative progression, for pushing the envelope when it comes to uncompromisingly patient storytelling. Is it truly better in that regard than, say, Bela Tarr's masterpiece Satan Tango, which was tied with Dielman at 36 last decade only to fall 42 positions as the feminist flick rose to number 1? Just some questions. Still, I want to end on a positive note. I might be a movie classicist, but I'm actually glad to see Mulholland Drive and In the Mood for Love in the top 10. They have been growing steadily in appreciation for 20 years and both have undeniable richness in their storytelling and visual style. And to conclude, let's take our hats off for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which not only topped the director's poll for the first time, but in the critics' list for the third decade in a row, still sits comfortably in the 6th spot. Have a nice day.